At first, we didn't have a piano. I took lessons, but we had a paper keyboard that I practiced with on the dining room table.
Chicago, 1931. At the height of the Depression, Daniel Ellsberg was born.
And then we got an upright piano, eventually a Steinway.
At the age of 5, his father, Harry, moved the family of 4 to Detroit, where he took a job as a structural engineer.
My sister was born 11 months after me, was named Gloria, but she didn't play the piano to speak of. She wasn't good at it, and so she didn't evoke my mother's ambition. So she got off.
However, his mother Adele had high expectations that Daniel would become a concert pianist.
So I spent my time then practicing. By the time I think I was 10 or so, I was practicing 6 hours a day in the afternoons. But I didn't have any social activities, couldn't do athletics or anything. So in that respect, it was an unusual childhood. But I would have said otherwise, a happy childhood.
That happy childhood was measured against the backdrop of World War II. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Ellsberg's father served the country designing factories to build bombers. Dan followed the war closely through the eyes of an adolescent. After the war ended and the American century began, his childhood took a tragic turn. It was 1946. Dan was 15.
So we were driving across the country, and on July 4th, very hot day, we were driving from Davenport to Des Moines in Iowa through cornfields on a very straight road.
The family had just stopped for a picnic lunch and were getting back on the road. They were about halfway on the 1,200-mile journey from Detroit to Denver. They were rushing to make it in time for a family gathering. Although it was Dan's turn to sit in the front seat, his sister Gloria jumped in ahead of him. Being a good big brother, Ellsberg shrugged it off and climbed into the back seat with his mother.
I was on the floor on a suitcase because she had her legs up, and I was sitting with my head behind the driver, and my father fell asleep at the wheel, and he ran into a culvert, sheared the side of the car off, and killed my mother and sister. My father just got a broken nose, and I had got a concussion. My sister was sitting next to him in the death seat.
Ellsberg was in a coma for 36 hours and had no memory for the following month. But the void of losing his mother and sister was inescapable, a trauma that would shape his life.
My father falling asleep at the wheel did tell me something about authority, I think. I didn't consciously connect it, but it did make me wary of authorities that I had full love and respect for, but they might fall asleep.
For Ellsberg, this wariness sharpened a sense of personal responsibility as a guardian to remain vigilant. From here on out, he was determined to do everything he could to avert catastrophe. He would not let America fall asleep at the wheel. The Ground Truth Podcast presents The Whistleblower, Truth, Dissent, and the Legacy of Daniel Ellsberg, a public history project to mark the 50th anniversary of the release of the Pentagon Papers in partnership with the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I'm Charlie Sennett, founder of the Ground Truth Project. Episode 2, The Force of Truth. In this episode, we take a detour on Ellsberg's journey to releasing the Pentagon Papers in 1971 to excavate the foundational influences of his life, how he developed such an ardent commitment to truth-telling, and we reveal how he was transformed from hawk to dove. This evolution was shaped by nearly every facet of his life, from that horrific childhood trauma to his intense academic training, his service to the nation as a Marine, and the love of his life, Patricia, helping to open his eyes to the war's impact on Vietnamese civilians. The tragic loss of his mother and sister would alter the course of his life in every way. Any notion of becoming a concert pianist was gone. Now raised by only his father, he was an adolescent careening down a narrow road with survivor guilt running in one direction and a newfound freedom heading in the other.
The world was now open to me. I could now read as much as I wanted, but I actually continued playing Claire de Lune or romantic things, which I liked. I performed in a school talent show playing Bumble Boogie. In other words, things that my classmates would enjoy.
The piano provided moments of levity, but the dissonance of the Cold War reverberated all around him. Ellsberg's vigilance was awakened. He began to identify as a Cold Warrior. In his words, a Truman Democrat, liberal on domestic matters, but realistic and tough against communism. This toughness was tempered with proportionality and a commitment to the sanctity of civilians in war, a belief shaped by the fallout of the bombs dropped in Japan in 1945. Even as a junior high student, he understood the scale of inhumanity of the incendiary bombs in March and then the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August.
It didn't start right with the atom bomb. The willingness to kill 100,000 people, civilians, in one night, on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, in Tokyo, was a change in the deliberate policy of this country. It was clearly a crime against humanity. It was a war crime, but it was hardly known to the American people. But the atom bomb brought home to them that Americans had done this, and it was told in the context that it had ended a war, which was false, that nothing else could have shortened the war, that it saved lives more than it killed. It was seen as a legitimate instrument of war that had moreover been successful as nothing else could have done. It has made this country and its leaders and its people willing to pay for, to contemplate, to plan for, and to be ready for, on alert, to destroy humanity.
Ellsberg felt the weight of the world and strengthened his commitment to academics. He went off to Harvard on a scholarship to study economics. After graduation, Ellsberg was looking for an adventure, far away from the data models and abstract theories he'd been studying. He also was called to serve his country, so he joined the Marines. Ellsberg felt most drawn to this branch of service because he believed it shared his commitment to the sanctity of civilians. At the time, it was an unusual path for a Harvard graduate, but Ellsberg was training for his role as a Cold Warrior.
The growing menace of communism arouses the House of Representatives' Un-American Activities.
It was 1953. Victims of the Cold War were mounting. At home, patriotism was on trial as McCarthyism destroyed the lives of anyone suspected to be a communist sympathizer.
Now, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
Around the world, a near constant state of alert suggested the United States was on a war footing against the Soviet threat and barreling toward an imminent showdown with communism. The Korean War was ending, but the Cold War was opening on other fronts.
The place is Dien Bien Phu in French Indochina, the lonely jungle outpost surrounded by communist guerrillas and accessible only by air is doomed, just as the once mighty French colonial empire in Southeast Asia is doomed.
By 1954, the revolutionary forces defeated the French, ending the First Indochina War.
This is the end of 8 years of bloody fighting in Vietnam, a shadowy, sinister war that has cost France dearly.
But this gave way to the Second Indochina War, what the Vietnamese called the Resistance War against America, what Americans would call the Vietnam War. Ellsberg returned to Harvard in 1957 to complete a PhD in economics, focusing on an area called decision theory. In its most basic form, it explores rational decision-making amid uncertainty. For a future war planner, this specialization seemed vital to the national interest. Decision theory was hot in academic circles, and Ellsberg's research caught the attention of the RAND Corporation. RAND is a nonprofit think tank contracted by the U.S. military and what Ellsberg called the Vatican of rationality. Just as he was earning his stripes as a top expert at RAND, particularly in the risk analysis of the Soviet nuclear threat, Ellsberg was now serving a new commander-in-chief.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price.
Ellsberg admired Kennedy They both shared Harvard and military service. In many respects, Ellsberg was a classic Kennedy man, and he hoped to serve the president as a watchful guardian of the West's Cold War ideology.
To assure the survival and the success of liberty.
I was trying to produce information that would help the people in power possibly make things better. That's the way I thought of it. But much more specifically, I have to say, and here it gets personal, avert disaster. Yes, I am focused more than other people, more than my wife on others, on the possibility of catastrophe. And yes, that can be related to my experience of catastrophe when I was 15. And then that brought me into situations where I learned more about the possibility of catastrophe. I did learn it in Vietnam, but above all, I learned it in the nuclear situation, the possibility of catastrophe.
Good evening, my fellow citizens.
In October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis presented such a possibility.
The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Ellsberg was summoned from RAND offices in California to the Pentagon. He was to help draft plans for a counterattack should the Soviet Union launch missiles from Cuba.
The most dangerous situation since the end of World War II. The next 48 hours will be decisive.
Kennedy and Khrushchev brought America and the world to the brink of nuclear war.
Word comes from Moscow. Khrushchev has ordered the missiles returned to Russia.
Although Ellsberg and the others in the Pentagon were celebrating the de-escalation and Khrushchev's decision to remove the missiles, it's important to remember just how much that threat of nuclear annihilation loomed over America at this time and how that fear drove foreign policy. After Kennedy's assassination, Ellsberg's commitment to serve his country deepened. With Lyndon Johnson assuming the mantle of power in the White House, Ellsberg brought the same sense of vigilance to the Pentagon.
When I was in the government, one thing that becomes your identity is you are a president's man. But in the bureaucracy, the national security bureaucracy in particular, now, you feel you're working for a transcendent purpose, national security, even if the policies don't seem to you to be best suited to that. But still, that's what your superiors are trying to do. The purpose is important. But you're doing it for the president. Not for Congress, not for the government, for the president.
Ellsberg wrote that his highest ambition was to be working for the president on policy. But performing that role also came with a great responsibility.
To be a president's man, you have to be trusted by the president. You have to be trusted to keep his secrets.
Ellsberg was now an insider in the Johnson administration. His guiding motivation was that of a cold warrior, defending the ideals of liberal democracy, what he felt the United States stood for. But those ideals would be hard to find amid the stark reality of the devastation on the ground in Vietnam. That would begin to wear on Ellsberg's conscience. In the previous episode, Dan and Patricia's relationship was a bit rocky in Saigon back in 1966. It would end in Dan calling off the engagement, and they wouldn't reunite until 3 years later. But before that split, there was a moment in Saigon when Patricia's eyes were open to the plight of the Vietnamese civilians. She took Dan along to see it for himself.
Dan, of course, was working during the day, and I was in his colonial house with nothing to do. So I thought of an idea for an article on how were we taking care of the refugees from our bombing and from the war in Saigon itself. So I had something to do, but it was so enraging.
She took me to a refugee camp, and we'll always remember walking on a wooden plank from one hut to another through a field of mud interlaced with shit, feces, and balancing on these planks to get from one place to another. I knew that the only thing that would bring people in from their hamlets where they were tending the graves of their ancestors, that was their major form of their religion, rituals and language. I'd been in the field all over Vietnam by that time. The only thing that would bring them out of those villages was our bombing. And the bombing would drive them into these fields of shit. around Saigon.
And so I'd come home after interviewing some of the AID people, the bureaucrats. They really didn't give a damn about the people that were under our control. And it just made me furious to see.
As a Marine, and later in the Department of Defense, Grand Corporation, I've been very conscious of the just war doctrine of not killing civilians, the immunity from deliberate attack of non-combatants. And how do we describe non-combatants? Well, generally civilians, elderly, sick, yes, women and children. That's the typical thing, women and children. Now, guess where that might have originated? It struck me just a couple of years ago that the idea of protecting a mother and daughter might be specially sensitive in my own mind. That doesn't seem so obscure, but I hadn't thought of it. And like most people who have a concern, you start and spend most of your life thinking that everybody shares it in the same degree. And when they don't, you're apt to be rather critical of them, and say, well, this is obvious, why shouldn't you do it? Well, granted, I do have a special reason, and that was that I woke up on July 4th with a mother and sister, and that evening I didn't have them.
He may not have been conscious about it, but that loss informed how Ellsberg was seeing the world, and it was definitely informing how he saw the plight of non-combatants. The relentless U.S. bombing campaigns were causing deep introspection. Over their 50 years of marriage, Dan and Patricia seemed very much in sync in their priorities, morality, and activism. Many presume that Patricia played a determinative role in Dan's turning against the war. Patricia often revises that assessment.
I get a lot of congratulations for having changed Dan's mind, and I wish I could say that was true, but I really didn't. I didn't play that big a role in changing Dan's mind about the war.
Something I've learned at 90, but I learned it long, long ago. You can be with someone for 50 years and still have problems of communication, still misunderstand each other, still not understand the past or the present. When I mentioned that to her the other day, she was saying, well, but we're good about, getting it straight. But it can take a long time. Now, I've learned in the last 2 years of, looking back over the past, and even in the last couple of months, things that I didn't understand before.
One of those things was why Patricia hadn't tried to change Dan's attitude toward the war.
I said, how could you be going with somebody, given what you thought about the war? How could you be going with me? And she said, I was madly in love. So it goes. And she didn't try to have, much influence on me. But the reality was that in the 3 years we were apart, I met other women who had this nonviolent perspective.
After Ellsberg's return from Vietnam in 1967, the veteran Cold Warrior was steadily developing an alliance with an unlikely faction, the anti-war movement. Even though he'd lost hope in the war by this point, Ellsberg was still attempting to glean some lessons on how the country could make better decisions in global conflicts. In 1968, at a conference called America and the Revolutionary World, Ellsberg wanted to learn how the U.S. government can counter popular revolutions around the world, as it had attempted to do in Vietnam. The conference attendees, however, expressed what would be to Ellsberg revelatory ideas and a challenge to his humanity.
I was having lunch during a break, and one of them was a very striking Indian woman with a caste mark, she was a Brahmin, on her forehead, and a sari.
He looked very, very good looking, well put together and muscular and glinting eyes and great smile. Very charming, very charismatic, very attractive person.
Her name was Janaki Natarajan, and she and Ellsberg connected right away.
The two of us, when we just sat and talked. And so our conversation was my being appalled as I learned more and more about his life, Daniel had huge experience with the ruling class and knew what they were very deeply and knew what the military machine was very deeply, its details. And that was amazing to me to even begin to listen to some of the details and become more appalled, by all of that. The things that he felt that he had to do as part of sort of patriotic duty or something. And my trying to understand that, because I'd never met with it face to face, so to speak, before.
And the profundity, it seemed to me, that she was introducing me to thoughts that I simply had never entertained before.
Janaki was born in 1941 in Bangalore to parents who knew and followed Gandhi. She was a graduate student at Harvard, where she was active in the Black students movement.
And 1968 was a very important time, both in the civil rights movement as well as definitely in the anti-Vietnam War situation. And the American Friend Service Committee, the Quakers, had put this conference together to bring together doves and hawks. I don't know that I would have said he was a hawk or a dove or something, but I would certainly say he was from the organization of war and the military, and that he was wondering what all this was that he was hearing in this place.
And it made me sit up and say, what do you mean by that?
But how to get him to change his historical thinking to being against the tremendous rationality of war. And that, to me, was the sort of challenge, if you like. And I wasn't going to give up. I wanted him to stop doing what he was doing.
And I was impressed. There's more to this than I thought. She recommended some reading for me along these lines. I wanted to pursue this. Since it was new, I'm curious, a new way of thinking. Hadn't thought of it.
I felt that there was definitely a very compassionate and human questioning that he was doing at this point, from what he had actually seen the war do to Vietnamese people. Seeing it as sort of the humans that were affected by the war machine was what was the kind of a trigger for his thinking.
And I began a real education that changed my life.
And he knew the war machine. And for me to get a glimpse of his placement within that war machine was quite shocking. To actually meet somebody, who was part of it, and who necessarily didn't seem to be just walking away from it either at that point.
The second part of my life was actually beginning that day.
So my question then became, how do we oppose the things that we're part of, like the caste system, but not really knowing how to bring down the war machine that he was part of? The structure is there, the ideology is there, everything's there. What do I do? How do I get out of it? What do I do now? I think that's a very, very crucial question, which really resonates today in very powerful ways.
For 2 years, I've been telling people, this is totally stalemated. It's not getting any better. You might say doing what I could inside to shorten this war.
And as we talked and as time went on, I got to know that he was really considering what to do. What could he do? And I was very struck by what I felt was his personal courage.
From Janaki, I was led to read Martin Luther King, Barbara Deming, Gandhi, pacifists, anarchists, civil disobedience, people in the tradition of Gandhi, basically. And she had convinced me that I had become convinced that I must meet Martin Luther King.
This is a teacher. This is a great man. This was somebody that can teach you. So go see him.
He had actually given a remarkable speech in 1967.
A time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam.
No better talk on Vietnam has ever been given than that April 4th, 1967.
These are the times for real choices and not false ones. We are at the moment when our lives must be placed on the line if our nation is to survive its own folly. Every man of humane convictions must decide on the protest that best suits his convictions. But we must all protest.
And I had just made the decision that I would really go out of my way to try to hear more of him and to meet him.
Martin Luther King delivered that speech a year earlier to the day. But now it was Sunday, April 4th, 1968.
Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
It was a shock. I mean, it's like you're numbed by that. I mean, when Gandhi died, I remember I was with my parents and listening to this big radio, and we were just, no, this can't be happening. This can't be happening.
After the conference, Ellsberg returned to Rand, but was also advising Senator Robert Kennedy, still trying to effect change internally.
My understanding is that he's looking for more normally political ways of stopping all of this. It was personal, but it was also the systemic way. How am I going to do this? What needs to be done in the politics of the time to be able to overthrow it? But it became increasingly, what am I going to do? The personal stance of the truth teller.
Just 2 months later, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated.
Those assassinations were just mind-stopping. And that was very significant for Daniel. Because Daniel, he was looking at people who would help stop it. Bobby Kennedy, I think, was very central to that.
Bobby Kennedy's death would force Ellsberg into despair. In November 1968, the Democratic candidate Hubert Humphrey narrowly lost. A slight majority of the country were encouraged by Nixon's campaign promises.
I to you tonight that the first priority foreign policy objective of our next administration will be bring an honorable end to the war in Vietnam.
Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Richard Billhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office.
There was a new president. He promised to end the war with honor, he said, whatever that meant. And that surely a new president would not follow in the footsteps of his four predecessors and continue the war. I knew that was another lie.
In one way, the new administration had broken from its predecessors by abandoning the ground war. Instead, increased bombing rained down from B-52s across South Vietnam, North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. By August 1969, Ellsberg was in a familiar position. He was given an insider's account that the country had been deceived. His close friend, Mort Halperin, was working under Henry Kissinger, Nixon's new national security advisor.
I was told by Mort Halperin, who was working for Kissinger, and this was crucial, that in fact he was going to escalate. He was going to threaten to escalate in hopes and expectation he wouldn't have to, that they would back down. He thinks he's going to end the war quickly with these threats. I don't believe that.
Nixon wasn't ending the war, he was preparing to widen it, even contemplating the use of nuclear weapons. Later that same month in 1969, Ellsberg attended the War Resistors International Conference at Haverford College.
I had invited him to that conference. I said, you should come to this. You'll meet all these people. But by this time, of course, there was, very clearly an understanding that everything had to be done to stop it, and a commitment to nonviolence. And of course, the war was going on. The body bags were coming. The napalm was going.
That conference at the end of August in '69 is what changes my life, basically.
Ellsberg has often reflected how a single speech at this conference split his life in two.
Last month, David Harris went to jail.
Randy Keeler, a war resistor who had been indicted and was awaiting arraignment, delivered that speech.
And many others are already in jail.
Ellsberg was in the room, August 28, 1969.
I'm not sad about that.
He hadn't heard these words since. We surprised him by sharing a recording of the speech.
There's something really beautiful about it.
Oh, wait, is this his speech? Oh, wow. Hey, go ahead.
And I'm very excited that I will be invited to join them very soon.
He insisted on listening to the full 24 minutes.
And lots of people all around the world, like you, will carry on.
By the end, Ellsberg was overcome with emotion and had to stop the interview.
Thank you.
Ellsberg left the room trying to compose himself. That is actually similar to the first time he heard that speech. On that day, he left the auditorium and broke down in the bathroom. Randy Keeler recounts how powerfully his speech struck Ellsberg.
He told me that for a long time he was sort of crouched on the floor. He just wept. He said he couldn't stop crying. You know, I can't really know what the emotions were all about, but I think it was because he was asking himself a question he had never asked before. And as soon as he asked it, he knew the answer. That he was privy to secrets that he could get in big trouble if released, but that might help end the war. He knew that. Here's Randy going to jail, counting on the rest of us to do what we can do to stop this goddamn war. And I am somebody who could do something. I'm guessing that's sort of what was going through his mind and his heart and his conscience at that moment. We encourage each other. As Dan, I think, was the first one who said to me, conscience is contagious. And I have used that phrase over and over and over again. And it is. And I think what Dan perceived as my act of conscience, announced in my speech, was a contagion that he couldn't escape. He caught it. So,
without that example of someone who was willing to was going to prison, actually, to convey what? Not a document, he didn't have any, but his conviction that this war was wrong and that one should not participate in it, which I agreed with, and that therefore he should not participate. That put in my mind the idea I should not enable lying and deception and an aggressive war any longer.
The new ways of thinking that Ellsberg gleaned over the previous year, he would now apply to the crisis in Vietnam.
Every kind of action, good or bad, requires the cooperation of others, and you withdraw that cooperation, basically. You withdraw obedience, participation, you withdraw deference, you withdraw resources that they may need nonviolently. Well, that was a coherent concept that I wouldn't have thought was possible. How to live without enemies and yet to resist harmful acts by others.
Ellsberg realized he could disarm the powerful by taking away the secrets and complicity they wielded. He could commit an act of dissent without bloodshed, without violence, without risking national security. And as he was learning through his study of Gandhi, truth-telling itself was a form of dissent.
The philosophy and tactics of active nonviolence. The word satyagraha, that's what Gandhi proposed, what he did. And it means satya, truth, graha, force, is what I did learn. And how to act on it, how to act on that kind of truth.
For Ellsberg, a specific set of lies spilling out of the Nixon White House in the coming days would push him over the edge and spur him on to deploy the force of truth. On September 30th, 1969, news reports were coming in from Saigon about 7 U.S. soldiers awaiting trial since July. The group, under Colonel Robert Rowe, was accused of murdering a Vietnamese civilian.
The 7 officers involved in the Green Beret murder case are flying home tonight. The murder charges against them were suddenly dropped by the Army yesterday. CBS News.
President Nixon stopped the court-martial of special forces officers, and men, for what they had clearly committed, the murder of a civilian under their charge, who they suspected wrongly, it turned out, of being a double agent.
Colonel Robert Rowe ceremoniously burned the paperwork he had prepared for the trial. Do you see any circumstances under which homicide is justifiable in espionage work? I don't think that you can make the terminology homicide. War is a difficult and dangerous business. People get killed in war, and this is not considered to be homicide.
They had lied about this up through the chain of command, which led General Abrams to be so enraged at the lying that he instituted this court-martial because he'd been lied to. And then the president said it had nothing to do with this decision, which was a lie. The Secretary of the Army then, Resor, said it was his decision, which was a lie. He was actually for the court-martial. Nixon, for political reasons, had demanded that he end this court-martial so as to show people that Nixon had the back of these people. And when I read that in the Los Angeles Times on September 30th, 1969, I said to myself, this is the system for which I worked for a dozen years and more. In the Marines, in the State Department, in Vietnam, in the Defense Department. A system that lies from bottom to top, lies to conceal murder. And I won't be a part of this anymore. I said to myself, in my safe, I've got 7,000 pages of documents showing lies, deceptions, reckless decision-making, murderous, which amount to mass murder in the end. And murder is not something to be stopped just by turning away from it, not participating in it. It's to be exposed, resisted. You've got to do something about it. And I went to my friend Tony Russo and said, do you know where we can find a Xerox machine?
This moment was the culmination of 2 years of pivotal events in Ellsberg's life that turned him from a Cold War hawk to an anti-Vietnam War dove. He was ready to expose the lies of the war, to betray the trust he had been given as an insider in the Pentagon, and he was summoning the courage to face the severe consequences of doing so. In the next episode, Ellsberg begins copying the 47 volumes, 7,000 pages of classified documents that contain the government's lies, failed policies, and internal doubts toward the Vietnam War. Once those secrets hit the front pages of the New York Times, the Nixon administration zeroed in on Ellsberg as a traitor, a public enemy.
We gotta get this son of a bitch.
Who Henry Kissinger would call the most dangerous man in America.
This is an attack on the whole integrity of government, that if whole file cabinets can be stolen and then made available to the press, you can't have orderly government anymore.
It's not too late to attend our free online conference to mark the 50 years since Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers. But hurry, it's happening now, April 30th to May 1st. It's a rare opportunity to sit in on a conversation between two generations of whistleblowers, Daniel Ellsberg and former NSA contractor Edward Snowden. To register for this free conference, visit ellsbergpapers.org. You can also find the link in the podcast description on your app. Tell us what you think of this podcast, and tell your friends they can find the Whistleblower series on their favorite podcast app. The senior producer of the Ground Truth podcast is Mitch Hanley. Special thanks to Jan Thomas and Michael Ellsberg. Marketing and promotion by Maggie Taylor and Ground Truth's Josh Coe. The University of Massachusetts at Amherst made the historic acquisition of Daniel Ellsberg's papers in 2019. That archive is now curated at the W.E.B. Du Bois Library. Special thanks to Professor Christian Oppie in the History Department, Professor Kathy Ford in the Journalism Program, and Jeremy Smith, Ellsberg Archivist at the Special Collections and University Archives. I'm Charlie Sennett, founder of the Ground Truth Project. I want to tell you about another podcast I think you'll like. The Last Archive from Harvard historian and New Yorker writer Jill Lepore. This season, Lepore is investigating purveyors of doubt, hoaxers, fraudsters, pseudoscientists, and how the peddling of doubt evolved over the 20th century, leading all the way to the Capitol insurrection on January 6th. This show is unlike anything you've heard before. History animated by long-lost archival tapes and documents, intrepid reporting, and radio drama reenactments. The last archive unfurls like a classic 1930s gumshoe mystery, but takes on the big issues of today. How do we know what we know? And why does it seem sometimes, lately, as if we don't know anything at all? Listen to The Last Archive wherever you get your podcasts from Pushkin Industries.